New research by the Australian Property Council has busted a myth that international students are to blame for the country's housing crisis. The reports found the rental crunch is actually being driven by a rise in solo person households and second bedrooms being converted into home offices. For more on this, we are joined now by Tori Brown, who oversees student accommodation for the Property Council of Australia. Tori, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Ruby.
So at the end of COVID lockdowns, we had tens of thousands of international students coming back into Australia when face-to-face learning recommenced, and there were concerns raised that this was going to create additional pressure on housing in the midst of one of our worst housing crises. But you have done research that pushes back against this narrative.
We have. So we have seen a lot of myths in the marketplace, really putting the blame for the lack of rental affordability and rental availability at the feet of international students. But when we actually look at when rents started to go up and availability of properties started to drop, we can see that that started happening in 2020 when there were no international students in Australia due to COVID. So as international students have returned, people have started to say, well, it's their return which is driving rent and availability, but we know it's far more complex than that, that there are a number of supply and demand issues across the market that are having an impact and leading to record low vacancy rates.
Do you think that xenophobia plays a role in this myth?
I think international students are visibly identifiable when you're lining up for a rental inspection. So I do think that that is a part of it. I also think that they all returned at once, so people were very aware of international students re-entering the market. But what we can see is that the problem in the market was already there and growing. It just so happened that all of this perfect storm of housing pressures sort of came together at the same time. So we're seeing fewer Australians living together. We're seeing more people using their home office, their spare bedroom as a home office instead of having a flatmate. We're seeing the rise of solo households. We can see that there are more people living in more houses, but they're in smaller amounts. So rather than having a flat or a couple living together, we're seeing an increase in the amount of people who might be living alone post-divorce, particularly in their 30s and their early 60s. We're seeing more people take up more homes.
So it's really a multifaceted issue. And where do international students tend to live and how do they tend to set up their households?
So what we found with this report is that international students are not competing with mums and dads, families in the suburbs who want a whole house, lots of bedrooms for the kids, a backyard for the dog. International students live in very concentrated areas within our CBDs and close to universities. They're far more likely to be in apartments and in student accommodation. They only make up under 1% in the vast majority of local government areas Australia-wide because they don't want to be out in the suburbs competing with mums and dads.
So Tori, international students aren't the cause of this housing crisis, but they certainly do feel the effects of it. I mean, what is it like to be an international student looking for a place to live in Sydney or Melbourne right now where there is such a crunch?
It's incredibly stressful, and we know that international students are a particularly vulnerable cohort. They only make up 4% of the rental market, but we know that when they arrive here, they've got no rental history. They often don't have an employment history in Australia. So they're not the ideal tenant when it comes to private landlords looking at who they're going to rent their homes out to. So they're already at a disadvantage. What we would like to see is more purpose-built student accommodation being built, because then they can apply for a room, it's guaranteed before they arrive in the country, and they know that they've got somewhere safe to land when they get here.
I mean, it does also seem like a space that is ripe for exploitation, and we often hear these awful stories about international students crammed into houses that are overfull. What are some of the challenges they face there?
International students often don't know their rights in the private rental market, so they're at the risk of landlords who might be slightly dodgy. They're at risk of being put into overfilled households. What we would like to see is more professionally managed student accommodation, because then they know that their rights are protected. They only make up 4% of the market, but they're our biggest economic driver when it comes to international education as a service export. It's worth $25.5 billion to the Australian economy. And we really want international students in Australia to have the best experience, and that includes having a really great living experience. And we need to be really careful when we talk about international students in the rental market. What we say locally has waves internationally, and we don't want to look like a country that is unwelcoming to international students.